Hello everyone, I hope that you've been well. Let's get started. Lately I have found myself enjoying a particular brand of online entertainment, something I used to enjoy in the early days of YouTube when it was more of a niche subject, before its explosion in popularity as a visual medium. You can insert your hipster joke in the comments. This brand of online entertainment these days is known as analog horror. You might be familiar with it, the use of found footage or YouTube channels like Local 58. This trip back in time when the broadcast day came to a close, the time of VHS tapes and CRT television sets. If you're familiar with this, the brief explanation I'll give will be redundant to you. Analog horror is primarily done in the second person, where you are the one that is subject to the fright and horror of the unknown. But it's not always the case. The horror of tuning in on some old public access channel and seeing things that are otherworldly or being given warnings, or messages being told to you through an old TV screen, recorded horror captured on a VHS tape from oh so long ago. Sometimes it can be caused by man, other times by powers that can only be described as the unknown, the eldritch, the work of God or the devil. For me, however, I think the type of analog horror I have enjoyed the most, or at least have consumed the most of in recent months, are EAS broadcast scenarios. EAS, or the Emergency Alert System, is something that you dread to hear, especially in the United States, whose alarm tone is one of the loudest and fear-inducing you'll hear, striking the fear of God in you even if it's just a broadcast test or telling you about a severe thunderstorm watch in the neighboring county 50-odd miles away. I would put the audio in as an example, but there are some ramifications on nearby radios or other broadcasting devices, such a warning that you'll find at the beginning of any of these scenario videos. Some of them are incredibly realistic, depicting a tornado or a Category 5 hurricane depending upon the location. Others dive into other kinds of horror tropes and what would sound like an EAS broadcast for it. Nuclear strikes, zombie virus outbreak, asteroid or meteor impact, all of these have been done to death. The really good ones are the ones that make it sound as real as humanly possible, the text-to-speech software perfectly emulating the voice heard by an actual American EAS. The delight not knowing in what's coming next, or what might be blaring on 5 seconds later after the broadcast comes in, as you hear about just how bad things are getting on the outside, wondering what might just happen next. The reason I find this kind of horror so enjoyable, especially now as we near Halloween, aside from me being the person that's actually been subjected to the EAS scenario, it's its usual third-person perspective that you don't seem to find in EAS and other forms of analog horror. It's the kind of stuff that's usually reserved for stories or horror films and TV shows. When it's good, it's actually believable. The idea that analog horror can be imagined in one's mind of people huddled up in their basements listening to a radio and looking at their phone screen as a disaster or some sort of outbreak plays out before them. There are several offshoots, of course, of EAS broadcast scenarios as well, including of the well-known SCP Foundation and its collective works in its community and its fiction. Horror, however, of course, is a broad subject. What scares me might be something that you laugh off, and vice versa. In fact, it's the very reason why I don't find so many horror films all that interesting. Not because the ones that do well are unpopular or don't scare people, but because they seem to be languishing. The feeling of which is that modern horror films are just formulaic. Paint by the numbers, a jump scare here, a greenish or a sepia filter there, all for them to come out and find what's causing all the trouble with a predictable crescendo in the music to denote that something terrible is going to happen soon, or maybe just subvert you with a jump scare. I wanted to look at our current state of horror and its ongoing difficulty to keep up with reality. I wanted to offer you all my perspective on the nature of horror, and the current horror that just seems to be sitting right outside our door. Horror, of course, can be broken down into two relatively broad categories, the man and the unknown. Man being that of man-made horror, the accident gone wrong or the creation of a certain technology that leads to its disastrous consequences. An example gone wrong as a trope is an excellent example of this, whether it's The Fly or The Lazarus Effect. Others, of course, would be like that of Don't Breathe or The Mist, wherein the real horror isn't the monster outside of the grocery store, but rather the horror of what the rest of the group inside may do, or just how strong and powerful a depraved blind man just might be to a group of ne'er-do-wells. But before I drop any more movie examples, it can be best described as man versus man, whether you're asked to want to play a game or simply running away from a slasher in a certain mask. The unknown, however, ranges from man versus nature to include the supernatural and religious entities. These are well known: A Quiet Place, The Fly, The Thing. And of course, this doesn't mean that the supernatural isn't left out, nor is the idea of exorcism or the demonic and religious. At one point in time, The Exorcist was called the scariest film of all time. To me, that movie hasn't lost its luster. Perhaps as someone who is more conservative and religious can see why the horror is there. And to a parent, even the first part of the film is depicting a mother, scared out of her mind, running out of options, being just as horrified and terrified as the actual truth of it being demonic possession in itself. While these categories are broad, I've recently found myself increasingly disinterested in either, at least visually in the movie-going sense. I find that the actual horror is right outside my window, or any time I turn on the news that's straight from the source, or when I'm reading blue checkmarks like that of people such as Brian Stelter. Not like conservative news is any better, ghosts dancing for boomer cons as they feel like they could take the country back tomorrow, although that's a phrase and call to action I can recall now at least in 3 separate electoral instances in my short lifetime. This isn't to dismiss the horror genre at all. I think it is somewhat in a slump, in the same way that most political fiction and television was absolutely astounded by the events of 2016 in the Trump White House, wherein South Park had to edit episodes the day after the election, or how House of Cards had to up the ante on winning power for the Underwoods, while Veep even had to use an even more incredulous electoral scenario to keep the show interesting and to keep it going. And by great extension, the horror genre is seemingly facing the same problems that we see with virtually any other television show right now, as it applies to virtually all forms of entertainment. At the beginning of this ongoing nightmare, the film Contagion was one of the most watched movies on Netflix. In modern-day television shows, the disease is even present. NCIS is talking about their shots before they go off and travel, and any procedural medical dramas having to mask up and mention the obvious elephant in the room, while the rest seemingly have to worry about the constant shooting and production shutdowns at the slightest sign of symptoms. While horror movies and shows continue to rage on in terms of production, it is certainly beginning to suffer the same problems as every other genre, with franchising, reboots, and old properties being made for television. This is an interesting problem of modernity, that the creative vision is often constrained or at the very least limited into the hands of a select few. Modern horror, in its imagination, lacks what older writers and filmmakers had to make sure that one truly trembled in terror. Perhaps it is due to the lack of novelty. As I said earlier, things feel eerily formulaic and repetitive. Haunted doll? Done. Demonic possession and consultation with a religious figure or demonologist? Well overdone. Of course, this is in part due to the rampant secularism and atheism that runs through our entertainment industry, and if not atheism, at least an implicit anti-Christian sentiment. Even when these demonic or religious entities are figured in a film, it's always the suburban or urban character that manages to somehow beat that demonic possession, that has always somehow just been out of reach for the religious leaders that they consult with. This isn't necessarily an age-old trend, but one that has been creeping into our present day for some time. The Exorcist has an actual consideration and reverence for the priest and his effort, although the Jesuit Father Karras is having a crisis of faith, and the mother is skeptical and not a believer in the faith herself. She is an actress of particular fame, and she only goes there when she's out of physical, materialist answers, and is recommended to go to a priest when all other options have failed in her plight for her daughter. Although, perhaps to counter this cursory look at horror, this may come from my own upbringing as well. If you were to ask me what the scariest film I've ever seen is, I would tell you that it was something I watched during the visit I had as a teenager to the Los Alamos testing site in New Mexico, detailing the Manhattan Project, nuclear testing after World War II, and the fear of nuclear apocalypse during the Cold War. Never has the otherworldly unknown felt less horrifying than the fact that at any moment, either by a glitch or deliberate malice, such man-made horrors could be unleashed upon us, with history telling us of two major incidents that brought us to the end of the world. Even now, such man-made horror has been unleashed on us, this time due to a Research and Virology Institute, American money, and lackluster safety protocols. Whether it's the atomization of man, hardened censorship, and the crackdowns on even the most basic tenets of human decency being smashed across the globe, I think it's best to conclude with the simple fact that most horror can't keep up with the inhuman, man-made disaster that borders on otherworldly. All I can say to you all is enjoy what escapism while you can, similarly to what I've been doing with these EAS scenarios, and by all means, do your best to find a way to keep going. But the nightmare outside my window, and maybe in your physical day-to-day life depending on where you live, continues to rage on in real time. And with that, my friends, the real horror has always been in the physical, present world around us, when the only thing really otherworldly to worry about is the transcendental plane of whether or not you're going to heaven or going to hell. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you all in the next video. Be prudent, everyone.